Hello everybody, my name is Dratnos and welcome to my tier list video for Mythic Plus Affixes. So this is, I'm trying to not have it be like how hard each of the affixes is, but instead have it be based on how interesting and fun to play I think the affixes are. Difficulty is a consideration. Things that are too easy or too hard are going to lose points for that, but I'm going to try and have this tier list not just be like, okay, these F tier ones are the ones that, are the hardest affixes and the S tier ones are the easy ones. So getting started in the F tier. I'm actually going to include the one affix that has ever been removed from Mythic Plus. Some of you may not know about this one. Overflowing. Overflowing used to be an affix where when you got overhealed, you then got a healing absorb shield equal to the amount that you got overhealed. It was removed pretty quick into Mythic Plus's history back in Legion, but it was pretty boring, not very much going on there, and it just randomly hosed some specs. So a pretty good example of an F tier affix. There's really not anything interesting going on with it. And just if you were playing like a Holy Paladin or a Holy Priest and you just had these like massive heals that always overhealed people, it was a huge punishing thing. And if you were like a Resto Druid where your healing was all small and incremental, you didn't notice it at all. So very, very non-impactful, uninteresting affix. Also in the F tier here, I'm going to place Skitch. I actually think Skitch is one of the weakest affixes on the list. It's not particularly hard as long as you have, misdirections or tricks of the trade or a high damage tank in your group, but it's a pretty binary check. Like if you just are playing with, a fairly low damage tank, say like a Vengeance Demon Hunter, and you don't have a Rogue or a Hunter in your group, it's just randomly going to mean that you have to wait like 5 seconds before you start hitting the mobs. And I don't think that gameplay is actually all that interesting in retail. I think that was a part of, the classic experience, for instance, that some people wanted to return to, but I would prefer if that kind of gameplay stayed in Classic and was not here in BFA. I don't really enjoy the way that Skitch is mostly a non-affix and then just sometimes randomly, especially if you're undergeared in the tank department, just is a big problem. All right, in the D tier, I'm going to place Tyrannical. Tyrannical has been in Mythic Plus since the beginning, although it's been moved from the level 10 row to the level 2 row with BFA. I find Tyrannical to not be, I find difficult boss fights to be fun and engaging, but I don't think Tyrannical really increases the difficulty of all that many bosses in an interesting way. It turns some bosses into okay, this is a really serious numbers check, and I don't mind that, but it turns a lot of bosses into 5-minute slogs, 5-minute marathons, and I really don't find that to be particularly fun. There are a lot of times in Tyrannical Week where I feel like, okay, this has been a fun boss fight. I'm ready to move on now. And the boss is still at 50% health. And I'm just like, oh, no. So that's why I'm putting Tyrannical down in the D tier. I find it to be a very boring affix in high keys. Also in the D tier, Infested. Infested was BFA's first seasonal affix. And I think there was some interesting design thinking going on with it. But unfortunately, it ended up being pretty not fun to deal with, Infested. There were a few spots in particular, the Kragmaw room in Underrot, where Infested could let you do some, you could do some Galaxy Brain stuff where you did big CCs. Sometimes you'd CC infested mobs and pull non-infested mobs, and sometimes you'd CC non-infested mobs and pull infested mobs. But in practice, I think in most dungeons, especially the more linear ones, Infested was just a big time loss, and you were just okay, kill the Infested first, all right, now kill the Gahoonies, and it just slowed down a bunch of pulls, and I don't think it was particularly fun. And sometimes it would just checkmate you, where you would mess up an infested pull, and then you'd come back to that part of the dungeon, and there'd be more infested mobs, and you'd be like, okay, I guess we're just zoning out. Now this is not a pull that we have any realistic way of doing. Also in the D tier, teaming. Teaming is kind of a cool idea, but in practice, it adds all kinds of time to dungeons, and they've kind of shown they don't really know what to do when it comes to adding teaming mobs. There's just randomly all these dungeons that get pulls that are way harder on teaming for no good reason. You could have seen this, King's Rest at the start of the expansion was a huge culprit here. They ended up removing most of the teaming mobs from King's Rest, most of the most egregious ones, but it's still there are so many dungeons where it's just okay, instead of there being 2 dervishes here, there are now 5 dervishes here, or in Ataldazar, for instance, there's randomness to the teaming pulls, so you just go in and zone in, and just sometimes there's an extra pack here, and sometimes there isn't. I think that teaming does not add all that much interesting stuff to dungeons, and is, in many cases, it just makes dungeons take more pulls and slows things down. And again, I don't find many interesting decisions to come from teaming, so I don't like it very much as an affix. Also in the D tier, Volcanic. Now, Volcanic is an affix that everybody is happy when it shows up on their keys, right? Because it's easy. It's very easy in most dungeons. And it's actually been nerfed, the damage it deals in BFA. but it's still, I think it's not, like, I think being fair to these affixes requires me to put Volcanic fairly low, because I don't think it actually, like, if my criteria is what affixes are interesting and fun to play against, I think Volcanic, the good thing about Volcanic is that it's an affix that kind of gets out of the way and lets you just play the rest of the dungeon and pull as big as you can, and that's kind of cool. But I think as an affix itself, it doesn't add all that much interesting stuff to the dungeon. Also in my D tier, Quaking. Now, this is Quaking as it is now, not Quaking as it will be in patch 8.3. Right now, it deals a huge amount of damage to the whole group without there being any counterplay, because it just deals 20% of your health every time it happens, no matter how well you spread. Once patch 8.3 hits and this thing deals no damage if you play around it correctly, I'm going to be willing to move this thing up to maybe B or even A, because I think that it'll be a pretty great affix at that point. But as of right now, Quaking is just a huge source of damage that turns off a lot of high keys. It means that, you know, it just 20% of your health randomly 3 times per minute is a huge amount of extra damage. And if it overlaps with some stuff, there's really not all that much counterplay to, like, you know, sometimes you could be like, okay, just pull when Quaking is about to happen, or pull right after Quaking has happened and we can avoid it. But in a lot of boss fights, just like randomly 3 minutes into the boss fight, there's a bad overlap between Quaking and a boss mechanic, and there's not any way for you to have played around that. And I think that no counterplay is a big drawback to an affix. It makes it a lot less interesting to play against. All right, up in the C tier, we have Raging. Raging is fairly interesting. You know, there are some pulls where you're like, okay, we only want one of these mobs raging at a time. That's kind of cool. Some mobs get pretty one-shotty with Raging, which is kind of annoying. And the fact that just Druids and Hunters can dispel Raging, I think, is a lot worse than either more specs being able to do it or no specs being able to do it. Because sometimes you're just in this group without a Druid or a Hunter, and you're just fighting like Windspeaker Heldis, and she enrages, and you're like, oh, I guess we were required to bring a Druid or a Hunter to this group or not pull this mob, right? And I think that is not particular. Like, I think only 2 classes having an answer to remove the Raging debuff is too few. I think it should be more or 0. Also in the C tier, Explosive. Explosive is an affix that has a lot of good things going for it. There's a lot of fun counterplay to it. It's pretty engaged. And one of the problems with Explosive is that not every class can do it, which means that all of the burden of Explosive lands on, like, one person in your group, right? Like, if you're playing with an Outlaw Rogue, the Outlaw Rogue's whole job is to do explosives. And that's kind of fun. It's engaging, it's difficult, but it's a lot of burden to land on one person. And the fact that if you're just in a group with, like, a couple of range specs or some melee specs that don't do huge instant damage to these things, like Assassination Rogues or whatever, that you can just be in this position where you're like, okay, explosives are going to be a really big problem for our group, I don't think is good. Also, I don't like how Explosive ramps up in spawn rate so aggressively as you pull more mobs. I think that having the explosive spawn rate be pretty constant, regardless of how many mobs you're fighting, would be better. I think it would be more interesting if there were more explosives on single target, and if there were a lot less explosives when you're pulling 10 mobs at once, because 10 mobs at once is already a big threat, and even a couple explosives can be a threat there, but, you know, 5 explosives spawn when you're fighting 10 mobs, and you're just like, okay, you know, I guess I'm not allowed to pull more than 1 pack this week, and I think that that's a big drawback for the affix. So if I were in charge of explosive, what I would do to make this an A tier affix, everybody can hit explosives, so make them like totems in PvP, where instead of taking like 20,000 health, scaling with affix keystone level to die, I would make it so that they just take 2 hits of any kind before they die, no matter how much damage those 2 hits did, and then they go away. So that would be my answer to that. That would mean that every class could handle them, and every class would have to actually invest a little bit of time, or 2 people would have to invest a hit into them. Whereas right now it's like, okay, Outlaw Rogues kill them in 1 global, Demon Hunters can kill them in 1 global, and a bunch of other specs have to spend 3 globals to kill them. I don't think that that's fun. So I would change that, and then I would make it so that they spawned more constantly, regardless of the amount of targets you're fighting. But still, I think that actually pretty good affix in terms of causing you to have to do gameplay. Just right now, those factors mean that it's a huge amount of overload on a couple of people in the group, and in a couple of pulls in the dungeon. But I think spreading that out more across the group in the dungeon would make this into one of the best affixes in the game. Also in the C tier, Bolstering. Lots of people hate Bolstering because in pugs in particular, it can go wrong really quickly. But there's a lot of counterplay to Bolstering. There are a lot of pulls where you can have a good plan against Bolstering and it works, especially, it's kind of a pain with like certain beguiling pulls this particular season when there's a Tides active in a pull, but most of the rest of the time, there's usually a good way to deal with each pull with Bolstering, and sometimes it requires you to think outside of the box, and I think that's okay. I do wish Bolstering were a little bit less punishing if it was done badly. I wish Bolstering, like, if a mob has been bolstered and then nothing has happened for 20 seconds, I wish bolstering just fell off. So just give it like a 20-second duration maybe, and then it eventually falls off. And I think that would be a better way to make it a little bit less awful in these kind of pug settings. But I still think it's actually a pretty fun affix and has a lot of good options for, counterplay. It does slow down the dungeon quite a bit though, which, is maybe a balancing issue for it. Also in the C tier, Fortified. Fortified, of course, the cousin of Tyrannical. Two affixes that are either one is active or the other is active. I don't mind Fortified as much as Tyrannical because Fortified doesn't come with the problem of making some boss fights last really long, so I think it's a little bit better than Tyrannical, although I still don't think it's particularly interesting, so I'm not going to give it anything higher than a C tier ranking. Also in the C tier, Grievous. Grievous is an affix that I think is cool to put some extra pressure on a healer. I think it's cool for there to be affixes that are hard for healers. I wish that it wasn't so disproportionately hateful to certain healing specs. So, like, Resto Druid has a pretty easy time with Grievous in most cases, and then randomly a bunch of specs that are already kind of in a bad place for healing Mythic Plus get especially hurt on Grievous weeks, specs like Disc Priest in particular. I think that is not a good balancing place for an affix like Grievous to land, so I wish that they would change. I wish that they would come up with, like, if I was in charge of Grievous, I'd make it a little bit less punishing, basically. I would make it so that it, when you're below 80% health, Grievous starts ticking, and it can't get a second stack until you're below 60% health, and it can't get a third stack until you're below 40% health, and it can't get a fourth stack until you're below 20% health. That would be how I would be making Grievous work if I was in charge of it. I'd make it a little bit more, like, sometimes there's this problem with Grievous right now where you're actively trying to remove Grievous, and it's still too much, and that brings it to this kind of place of, as I was talking about, like, no counterplay affixes, where I feel like an affix, if you're making a concerted effort and using your kit's best options against the affix, I feel like it should not punish you too much further at that point. I feel like when you correctly play against an affix, it should be possible to play against it more. And in some cases, on some pulls in some dungeons, with some specs, that's not true for Grievous, and that's a big drawback for it. All right, in the B tier, I'm going to put Beguiling. Beguiling is the third seasonal affix that they made in BFA, and they took a pretty big swing with this one. They put 3 unique mobs in random places throughout the dungeon, and they all have pretty impactful abilities. And I think, for the most part, Beguiling worked pretty well. There are some problems with it, specific specs being so good against it. Again, like Resto Druid having a unique ability to deal with Tide's emissaries and Enchanted emissaries compared to other healing specs. I think big problem mostly with class design compared to the affix design. Like, it's tough to come up with an affix that Resto Druid won't be OP against because Resto Druid is OP, but the fact that Beguiling is particularly good for Resto Druid is something that I think is a balancing problem for it. And the Void emissaries being particularly rough and, causing dungeon time to increase dramatically when it's Void week, I think is a problem as well for Beguiling. But for the most part, I like what Beguiling does to dungeons. I like how there are many different ways to attack each. You can skip this pull, or you can figure out a cool way to deal with the emissary, or you can, like, Ring of Peace and use that to only pull part of it at a time. Ring of Peace being so strong against it, maybe another balancing problem for the affix, but in general, I think that Beguiling was a big swing that added cool mechanics to dungeons, and overall, I'm glad that they took, a bold approach with the seasonal affix, and I think that they made some good changes in response to feedback with Beguiling coming out of the PTR, and overall I'm fairly happy with where they landed on it. Although, I do kind of wish seasonal affixes weren't active every week. I don't know, like, I feel kind of burned out from Beguiling, and it's just active every single week. I wish there was a way for them to have seasonal affixes only be active, like, a third of the time. Maybe just, like, every 3 weeks it's a seasonal affix week, and that week is, like, bonus rewards from Mythic Plus, and also the seasonal affix is active, and the other weeks you can kind of get a break from it. I kind of wish that were the way it worked, because Beguiling is fun, but, like, having dealt with it for 3 months and knowing that I'm going to deal with it for another 2 months, like, it kind of drains on you a little bit there. So I'm not sure if the seasonal affix paradigm is a perfect way for them to approach Mythic Plus. All right, also in the B tier, Necrotic. Necrotic is a tough affix. It's an affix that a lot of tanks don't enjoy playing against, and that is a drawback for it. Affixes that make it harder to find tanks, I think, are bad for just M+ population-wise. But I think it is pretty interesting. I think that the way that, a skilled tank can play against Necrotic and kite and drop stacks that way is cool. Some specs have an easier time than others with it, which is a drawback, but maybe more of a class design problem than an affix design problem. I do wish Necrotic had... There are some places where it feels like there's no counterplay to Necrotic, and that is a problem for it. I wish that Necrotic dropped off. Like, if I were in charge of Necrotic, I would make it maybe last 20 or 30 seconds and not increase, like not refresh in duration when it gains a new stack, so that every 20 or 30 seconds it would fall off automatically, and you would have an opportunity to bomb some heals into your tank before it starts stacking up again. I feel like that would be a cool way to make it actually have like a moment of counterplay, and you kind of, you know, you stack your defensives and you just are trying to get to that point where Necrotic falls off by itself. Because there are some boss fights and some trash pulls with Lieutenant mobs where there's really not a good answer to Necrotic unless you're playing some very specific compositions. And I think that that is a problem for the affix. The next affix in the B tier is Bursting. Bursting has some problems in low keys because Bursting doesn't scale with key level. So in like a level 10 key where you're just blasting through it, that Bursting is actually going to do way more damage per second in that 10 key than it would in a 22. And it's going to be a even bigger percentage of the damage taken in a 10 than it is in a 22. So I think that's a weird thing with it. I think that they maybe should scale the damage a little bit with key level and make it easier in lower keys. But in high keys, I think Bursting lands in a pretty good place where there are ways to play around it. Or if you can't play around it, you can brute force through it with cooldowns, and I think that's pretty cool. I think of the on-death affixes, this is one of the good ones for sure. I think a better place than, say, Bolstering and accomplishing a pretty similar effect in terms of what pulls it incentivizes you to do and which pulls it incentivizes you to come up with something creative to deal with the bursting stacks. And there's some cool like micro gameplay moments where you have 2 seconds left on your bursting stacks and you need to drop them. And I think that there's, you know, huge opportunities there for skilled players to stop damage and let the bursting stacks fall off. And I think that skill rewarding affixes are good ones. So that's why Bursting is up here in the B tier. All right, in the A tier, we have Sanguine. Sanguine is an affix that a lot of people don't like. They buffed it going into BFA, which I think was good, and they buffed it midway through Legion, which I think was good because it was really easy when it first came out. It would have been like a D or F tier at the start of Legion just based on it was so free. It was such a free affix like Volcanic was. But they've buffed it to the point now where it's relevant. And again, I think it's very skill-intensive affix. Almost every Sanguine problem is something that you could solve if your group was all thinking about it and playing great. But if you don't think about it, if you make mistakes, it's going to be a big problem. And I think that's a good place for an affix to be. I do have a problem a little bit with like how effective certain classes are against this again. Like if you're playing with druids in your group and you have typhoons versus if you don't, you can play a lot more sloppily and still be fine. Whereas if you're playing this like a composition that doesn't have Nox, you really need to play perfectly against Sanguine. So I think that is holding it back a little bit, but I still think a very good place and another great on-death affix. Finally, in the S tier, we have Reaping, the greatest affix of all time. Reaping was the seasonal affix back in Season 2, and it's been the most fun of any affix. It was fairly low impact throughout the dungeon, like Reaping Waves would rarely be a problem by themselves, but they could be a problem if combined with a hard pull. But my favorite thing with Reaping was how much you could like do a Reaping Wave onto something in a creative way, or you could come up with a creative time to spawn a Reaping Wave, or a creative way to skip a Reaping Wave. And it was just, you know, a big opportunity where a huge amount of enemies would come and you'd get a very fun moment where you were doing huge damage in AoE. I thought that was really, really cool. So I think Reaping is the best affix they've ever designed. I think it was flavorful, interesting. It came up a couple times for dungeon, and then the rest of the time in the dungeon, you didn't have to like be overloaded with a bunch of affixes active, like you kind of are with the other seasonal affixes. Because, you know, whenever a Reaping Wave isn't present, it's not something that you actually have to be worrying about in the same way that you did with Infested or you do with Beguiling. And I think that the difficulty being fairly low on this thing, I think a low difficulty seasonal affix is a pretty good place for the seasonal affix to be, because, you know, by the time you hit the seasonal affix, you have 3 other affixes rolling in the dungeon, and that is a high amount of, like, if you have 4 impactful affixes that you have to play around, I think that that's worse than if there are, like, if the affixes have a smaller impact for each of them, because then you can do bigger keys and you can just keep adding more pulls until it starts to be hard, and I think that that is a really cool place, and something that Reaping allowed us to do. So my biggest wish with Reaping is for it to return to the game. I wish that they would replace teaming with Reaping going into next expansion. We can do it, right? There's lore reasons. Bwonsamdi is going to be in the Shadowlands. We've got his little, you know, pocket dimension or whatever where he's hanging out. So we could just have Bwonsamdi, just keep him forever, bring him back. I miss him badly. So please, Blizzard, bring back Reaping. All right, that's been my tier list video. Hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching. Let me know what you thought of it. And check out my Twitch stream, twitch.tv/Ratnos. If you enjoyed this video, you know, go throw me a sub over there. Sub to this YouTube channel also. and throw a like on the video, all that stuff. Thanks so much. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.